Thank you very much for having me here. I was here many years ago. Ron Miller, the late Ron Miller, who was a very dear friend of mine, was a very dear friend of yours. And he brought me here, and everywhere he sent me, I got work. So it was great to have him as a mentor. And my husband and I used to love to go over to Common Ground and listen to their talks, and they had a similar situation, a setup. Sadly, because they're not for profit, they're no longer, but I have been facilitating a group for emotional wellness and self-awareness with the Enneagram for 10 years, and it was wonderful when we had our farewell time at Common Ground last month, and Reverend Norval of the Methodist Church of Christ said, "Come on over here and use one of our rooms to continue your group." So let me start by telling you the reason that I became passionate about this subject was because primarily, there's all sorts of reasons that converge, right, that come together. As John Lennon says, life is what happens when we're making other plans, busy making other plans. And why things converge the way they do is probably deeper than one thing. But the big thing for me was that when I was 18, I was in a nursing program at a college that I didn't really want to be at, but my father was a professor at the university that I wanted to be at, and I was afraid that he'd follow me all around, and like he was doing with my sisters, and I wanted to exercise a snippet of independence, and I was working at a clinic, so I thought, I'm a nurturing type, I'm going to be a nurse. Well, I got into the program, and I didn't do well. I'm a much more communicative and creative type than I am a science type. And it was difficult for me. All my friends had scattered off to, different places as they do as college freshmen. And I was very depressed. I was felt like this wasn't the right thing. Now, a lot of young people don't want to do what they declare a major in, but they don't fall apart. But I did. And I had what you would call a breakthrough. And my dad came to this college to pick me up, and he said, in his professorial but very kind voice too, he said, "What seems to be the problem?" And I said, "I don't know who I am." And he said, "You're a child of God." And I said, "I don't know what that means." And I didn't. I was in a very dark place. And it took me a long time. I got help. It was wonderful. This wonderful therapist looked at me and he said, "What's the matter? Are you a little confused?" And I felt like a house fell off my back. And he was fabulous and, became very important in my life from about the ages of 18 to 20. And then I continued to see him when I needed to throughout those fragile years of young adulthood. So now fast forward to finishing at the university I really love, getting a career I'm happy about. That takes a little struggle, but I end up in human resources and corporate recruiting, find the love of my life, all these good things, have 4 children, and now my youngest is going to kindergarten. A lady at church says to me, you and your husband like to do these discovery weekends, right? And I said, yeah, and that was patterned after Marriage Encounter. And I married a nice Jewish boy, and I was raised Catholic. So when we did this discovery weekend, and I said, "Would you like to be prayer couples or greeters or something?" He said, "I want to do it all." And I was like on cloud 9 because I knew that would be our connection, I didn't really need a partner in my life to have the identical faith that I had, but I did want, you want some kind of glue knowing we agreed to raise our children in a Christian tradition. So this lady suggested I do this class. The bottom line to this little story is, after these 2 years of personal development, learning to lead small groups and run retreats, etc., professors from Loyola waltz in and they say, "Oh, you've developed X amount of credits towards a Master of Arts in Pastoral Studies. And I thought, well, that's really nice. I was about ready to have my fourth baby, and I thought, I'm never going to do that, but that's nice. So, you know, again, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. My mother passed when my fourth was born. My mother passed, and now they give us a 5-year window. So I get into this program, and this is the thing that has neon around it for me. I loved all of it. I loved the feminist theology, and I loved all the good stuff. But there was something about this, and it's ancient for those of you who don't know it. It's just, they don't know for sure how old it is, but they think possibly 4,000 years old. And I don't know much about this, so I'm going to say it very briefly. But originally, it was called the Enneagon. Ennea means 9, by the way, in Greek. And it was about 9 celestial bodies in the sky. And somehow, it then took a human application over time, and it became the Enneagram. Now, what I would like to just see a show of hands of how many of you are somewhat familiar with it. And so how many are newcomers to it? Completely newcomers. About half and half. Okay, so what I want you to know is that from a standpoint of psychology, the Enneagram is 9 ways of being. From a standpoint of spirituality, the Enneagram is 9 manifestations of the divine. So somebody could use this. I've taught it for 17 years, and somebody could, in fact they have, in workshops said, I'm not very spiritual at all, but this is just about a paradigm about learning to live a better life from within, knowing yourself well, knowing when you're balanced, what it looks like when you're disconnected, what it looks like when you're very connected or centered is another way of saying it, or secure. So it's a way of seeing yourself. The more study you do, and the profile I happen to give, I call it an emotional MRI, because it sort of shows you very specifically what you look like. You, not you, but you. What you look like. When you're centered and safe and secure, and when you're coming from those gifts, and it shows you what you look like when you're disconnected and insecure and dysfunctional, all these things that kind of would go along, the same line of that train of thought. So the Enneagram, all those arrows that you see up there, and we'll get a little bit into that. My book is on the 7 mainstays, since this is a book presentation about this book, and it's called Who You Are Meant to Be, The Enneagram Effect. I got my title because a millennial, I was going to say the Enneagram Effect on Who You're Meant to Be, and I didn't like the on in there. And he said, why don't you call it Who You're Meant to Be? Why don't you give it to our generation who's seeking and searching? Call it Who You're Meant to Be, the Enneagram Effect. So that's how that came to be. But it's not an advanced book, but it is not a beginner book either. I mean, it's good for beginners or advanced. I'd like to say that it's somewhere in the middle, because I tell a short story about each type to get you familiar with because you certainly know all of these types. You fall within one of them. I like to say we are all of these aspects, the good, the loving, the effective, the original, the wise, the loyal, the joyful, the powerful, and the peaceful, are all aspects within us. But we have our home in one of these types. And it's really great news when you find it out. I mean, it's kind of a double-edged sword. You have to find out your shadow side, which isn't always the most fun. But actually, it's really, if you're used to doing inner work and you're about the truth setting you free, then it's not so bad. Finding out what your shadow pieces look like. And so I want to start with, I'm I'm going to cover the 7 mainstays that I write about in this book. I won't be able to share the short story of each type, but what I want you to do is look at your paper that you got. And if you have a pen, it kind of, for the beginners in the room, it helps to flesh out the types. If you take your paper on the diagram side and add, I'm going to give you, one time I said to one of my friends, Joanne, you're the powerful type on the Enneagram. And she said, tell me more. And I said, you're the powerful protector. And she said, oh yeah, that would be me. So she got it in 2-word descriptor. She didn't, not everybody, these are beautiful, these are lovely words. These are Jerry Wagner's words, who taught it to me, Dr. Jerome Wagner. And he wrote a book called The Enneagram Spectrum and a couple of other ones. But he uses these 1-word descriptors. And I think it's a great start, but I like to have you flesh out the type. So I want you to write, if you would, or remember the word, go to the type 1. And write, instead of just the good, and again, I want to just mention that each author will, there will be synonyms out there. You'll see different synonyms for these types written around by different authors. For example, the good person will be called the perfectionist, or the effective person will be called, personality will be called the performer. So, but here's what I like to call them, and that's what is in my book. So, if you'd write the word reformer next to the word good, the good reformer, I think that helps flesh out the type a little bit. This is a type that just sees a way how to make things better. It's just kind of their MO. They're wired, natured, nurtured for that. The loving giver. They are about the other. The effective, I like to call this type the effective achiever. The original, or you could call this type the individualist. The individualist, or people call it the romantic. So I say the original romantic, but I like individualist too. You could write that. The wise, 5, wise observer. And the 6, the loyal skeptic. 7, joyful adventurer. People call this type the epicure, variety of good tastes. The powerful protector. So you could add the word protector. And the peaceful mediator. You could add the word mediator to that. Now that gives you just a sense of what each of these types are at their essence. One of my friends is a loyal type, and she said, I don't like the word skeptic, though. I said, well, she said, everything else looks very positive, but skeptic. But when I say skeptic in the sense of essence, it's meant at its best, Otherwise, you could use the word faithful, the loyal, faithful type, They're very vigilant, and they, at their highest and best and most distilled essence, know that the force is with us, not against us. Great faith. So you could call that type the loyal faithful. Now, each of these types has an emotional passion. And the emotional passion, just like our emotions, isn't right or wrong. It just is. It's what we do with it. That it's kind of what makes us tick, actually. And it's what you do with it and how you manage it that is important for your own self-mastery. So, the Enneagram teaches, the wisdom says that let's start with 9, the peaceful type. I remember looking at that, and my husband's the peaceful type, and going, oh, he's the farthest thing. Doesn't sloth mean laziness? And he's the farthest thing from lazy. He's very ambitious and yada yada. But it's not about this is all about the self. So it's slothfulness of self. So it's more about being lazy with your own self-expression. So self-forgetting is another way of saying slothful, right? Self-forgetting, slothful with my expression, my self-expression. That's what that emotional passion is about. Now, everyone has an area of avoidance or a blind spot. The area of avoidance for this type is conflict. So you work hard to get to be peaceful, whether it's, we don't know all the answers to these things. We don't know if we come from another lifetime and we're working something out. We don't know if it's just nature and nurture, if it's the temperament, which is what nature is, right? It's how we grow in the womb and before, if there is, and then you come and you have nurture. You have caregivers. So, the peaceful type has this tendency to self-forget, to merge with others to keep the peace, and their blind spot or area of avoidance, which falls under the shadow. This is the shadow being the part of us that we don't really know about or we don't like, so we don't pay too much attention to it. And the area of avoidance for that type is conflict. So the reason that the conflict is important to remember with regard to this peaceful type, avoidance of conflict, is because when the peaceful type is centered, they say, oh, well, I don't want to discipline this 17-year-old. This isn't fun, but I got to get my feet into the game here. And I can't make my partner the bad cop. I got to get in here, even though I don't like it. And I'd rather run to the hills. But I'm going to get my feet in the game here, and I'm going to say what needs to be said to this 17-year-old. So when peaceful types take responsibility for their self-expression and being heard, because they might tell you, their persona will tell you, I don't really need to say anything. She'll take care of it, or I don't really want to say anything, or I don't care where we go to the restaurant, or I don't care, you pick the movie, or they can do that all day long. And they want to be heard. Everybody in this room wants to be heard. I want to be heard. I teach this so I can learn it more and more and more. You're sitting in these seats because you want to become, you're already resourceful, but you're sitting in these seats because you want to become more resourceful. And by that, I mean reconnected to your source. Resourceful. So when a peaceful type says to you, I don't really care, whatever, it would be helpful for you as a person who loves that person or cares about that person to say, I really do I want you to tell me though what you really feel. I don't want to just lead the way. I don't want to bulldoze you or, I think you have so many good ideas. Like, are you sure you don't care which restaurant we go to? That you get the message. And you're trying to get that person to not self-forget and not merge too much with you, because when they do that, they're going to do that. That is who they are at their essence. I mean, at their tendency, not their essence. Their essence is the pure part, which is balanced, which is about merging and being heard. The right, nice balance that they feel between merging with you and being heard. So that's just a little nugget about 9, the peaceful mediator. I want to just add that each of these types, this is what the arrows are about, has a corresponding type. When you center, if you're a 9, this wisdom says a corresponding type on this spectrum is going to flood into your very being and grace you and gift you with balance, with what you need. And conversely, when you abandon yourself and when you get stressed and disconnect, and this isn't house on fire stress, because that can bring out the best in you. This is our day-to-day patterns. When you just disconnect, this wisdom says, conversely, you're going to go to the low side of a corresponding type when you're already disconnected. So what that looks like for the 9 is when the arrow, and I want you to sort of burn this in your brain, when the arrow comes toward the type, so don't look at any arrow except 3 to 9 right now. When the arrow comes toward the type, that type has already gotten a handle on the fact that they're disconnected, they're a little, stressed, they're in that kind of place. And they say, I'm not going there. I'm not going there. I'm going to handle this. I'm going to, be heard, not be overly passive, not be overly passive aggressive, and so what they do is they become very effective, and they are already patient and mediating and receptive and paying attention to beautiful nuance the way 9s do, and they are merging, and they are all those lovely things, and they are now also goal-oriented. They're motivating, but they're motivators, because they're already motivated. They're motivated by their internal truth, which is, I get things done. And I get things done when I'm heard. And so the effective pours into the peaceful, and that I call a heaven on earth. That's sort of their heaven on earth. So conversely, the hell on earth looks like, the husband comes home from work and he's tired and he's a peaceful type, and his wife says, we're going out for dinner with the Smiths tomorrow. I hope that's okay. And we're going to have sushi. They picked the restaurant. And he says, okay, it's fine. And then they come home. He picks a little fight. She said, what is going on with you? And he said, she's okay. I don't mind her, but I don't like him, and I don't like sushi. And she's like, well, you couldn't have told me that? You couldn't have shared with me that you didn't like sushi. So, or that you could have put your foot down, could have said that's not for me. Well, he didn't want to do that because he was already tired, and fatigue can be a cousin of stress, so he doesn't want to get ruffled feathers, and so he doesn't say anything. And that's the pattern. That's the loop. So the fear and doubt that is coming, that he's dominoing down to within the 6, the loyal skeptic, his dialing down that he does or she does gets contaminated by this fear and doubt and says, I better not say that, I'll ruffle feathers. If I say that, this will happen, and all these kinds of even catastrophic thinking, can start happening for the 9 who is disconnected, the peaceful type who gets disconnected and dials down to a point where they aren't heard and they are stressed, and then now they are getting all this second guessing going. So that's the loop of disconnection and dysfunction. The second guess, self-forgetting and second guessing. Does that make sense? Self-forgetting and second guessing. So that when they are in that loop, they're not very happy. And we kind of go in and out of this stuff all day long. The healthier you are emotionally, the more you're going to stay in, the effective to the peaceful. But we're human. And I will teach all of this tonight, and tomorrow I will, maybe even tonight, probably tomorrow though, because I'll be tired and probably hit the hay early. But tomorrow, no doubt, I will do something that will be human and will be disconnected and will come from the lower part of my own personality type. And that's okay. It's when you get into this practice and knowing this is one thing, knowing these, I call this a wellness map, the arrows. So knowing your wellness map is really important, but practicing it is even more important, saying to yourself, okay, so say you're a peaceful type. So what did I do? How did I get there today? How did I get so disconnected? You understand what you did in a deep way. And so let's look at one. Each of these types has this wellness map, and each of them has an emotional passion and a blind spot or area of avoidance. I like the term blind spot because it's just a little easier. the good reformer brings to the table all these beautiful things like, integrity and ethical, responsible. And when they are disconnected, they get anger running, kind of a correctional anger. So they might say, a sister might argue with her other sister, and then the good reformer, the other personality says to the good reformer sister, "You're sort of cranky today." And she said, "Why are you so angry?" And then the sister says, "I'm not," the one who's the good reformer, the type 1 says, "I'm not angry, I'm just right." And, we all know what that feels like, even if we're not good reformers. But what she needs to do is turn that around and get a handle on that correctional irritation that sort of just is her little MO, her little program that runs her. And she needs to say, "You know what? It's no skin off my nose where we park. You're driving. I'm sorry. I'm not really," instead of saying, "I'm not angry, I'm just right," she needs to turn that around and say, "I'm not really right. I just get this anger running, this little correctional thing, And when she owns it, I have a saying, name it, claim it, to tame it. So when you own it and you know what's going on, what your issue might be, then you have a chance to navigate through it much more quickly, right? Than when you don't know what's happening. Where you're beside yourself, but you don't know why. So, the good reformer, when they, the area of avoidance or the blind spot is it's kind of funny because we say correctional anger, but think of the emotional passion as perfectionism. That will help you more. And then the blind spot is anger. I've asked many, 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 many ones, how often do you get angry in my counseling practice? And they'll say, "I don't get angry that often." And then I say, "How often do you like to be right?" And they say, "All the time." All the time. So the righteousness is the smokescreen for the anger. Does that make sense? So if you can catch yourself in the righteousness stuff, then you've got that emotional passion sort of running you all over town with a ring in your nose, instead of you being clear about what you're doing and then turning it around. Because when you turn it around, when you say to your sister who's driving the car, "It's really not my place to tell you where to drive, you're driving," then what you're doing is you're freeing up yourself, you're letting go. You're saying, "It's not always my problem." And that's super healthy for a 1. It's not always my problem. And what happens then, the arrow, you see how the arrow from the 7, the joyful type, floods into the 1? That's what's happening. They're enlightening. They're unburdening. And then they get all this gift and grace from the high side of 7. Because this wisdom says like attracts like. And if you've already centered, you're going to get grace and gifts. And then that's predominantly, it's coming from your own personality and then this corresponding personality. And in stress, conversely, the 1 beats themselves up. They get overly conscientious. Why couldn't, now say those sisters in the car, she didn't have that healthy response, and she said, I'm not cranky, I'm just right. And she kept arguing and argued more, and you know what I mean? It could get ugly. Then she is trying real hard to stand out and be special. And that's what goes on with the 1 when they're disconnected. The good reformer goes to the low side of original and wants to be special and can't figure out how to be special. So each of these are called points of integration and disintegration with PhD psychologists, but I find it a little easier to use the term wellness map, because when the arrow is coming toward your type on this paradigm, you feel well. It's real simple. You feel well. And when the arrow goes, when you're disconnected, when you're discombobulated, when you're beside yourself, when you're stressed, when you're dysfunctional, all those things, the arrow is going, you're abandoning your true self, you're going away from the essence, those gifts that are in you, and you're going to the low side. You're already at the low side of your own type. Now you're attracting the low side of the other type. So that happens for every single one of these personality types on the Enneagram. And the loving giver has, is about the other. If you only remember one thing about the loving giver tonight, it's that they are about the other. They are relationship oriented. And they are helpful, and they are good listeners and compassionate. And each one of these types brings abundance of gifts to the table when they're centered. And in my book, I have under the first, after the short story I told you about, that opens the chapter and the type, the next thing of the 7 mainstays is strengths and challenges. And I list about 10 for each type. So here on this little poster, you see about 5, but, or maybe 6 on some of them. But, you can sort of really almost meditate on some of these beautiful attributes of each of these people. And most likely you'll have some of them in your family. And you'll say, oh, yes, she is my little daughter who's a 1, who's 9. Yes, she is dependable. Oh, I can see, you can see all these little things in the personalities, already. So, let's look at 2. In a nutshell. I won't be able to go through all of them, but I want to go through, at least give you a handle on, I gave you a little brief description also of types. And so, you can look at that and, decide if you have a sense of, where you fit in, or you already know because you've done some, work on this. You could, study the other types a little bit. And, because the principle is when the arrow comes toward the type, it's being gifted. And I like to say graced. And when the arrow is going away from the type, it's dominoing down into the gunk further. Okay? So that, if you can just remember that principle alone, you can self-study and learn a lot about what goes on for each of these personality types that are on the back of your paper, the brief description, just as a nice place to start. So the loving giver has pride as their emotional passion. These emotional passions used to be called the 7 deadly sins, by the way, which probably, I don't love all that language anymore. The kind of, for me, they're a little bit button pushing. So I like to say, we don't really use that terminology. We say that emotional passions, or Dr. David Daniels, who, the late Dr. David Daniels, was a psychiatrist who used the term, driving energy. So I like that term too. Emotional passion or driving energy. So their driving energy, the loving giver, is pride. And they were told probably from the time they were little, we've all done that and meant well. Oh, you're such a sweetheart, to somebody. Isn't she caring? Or you see a little 2-year-old in an environment and they give their toy to somebody else. Or I don't know, it's just all these little things can happen to a little developing personality that make them know, that mirror back to them that they are a little giver. That they're a little helper, a little loving giver. And so, that's wonderful. There are a million beautiful things about each one of these personality types. And we have to have a personality before we can transcend it, right? The Enneagram, somebody once said to me, and I mean only one person in 17 years, but she did, I don't know if I like those personality systems, and they kind of put you in boxes. And I said, I just reminded her that the Enneagram is the antithesis of wanting to put you in a box. It is trying to show you the box that you're in so that you can peel the walls down occasionally, and peek out of the box that we live within. It's trying to help us connect to our spirit, where we have so much more and so much more of realization of our gifts. Right? And when we're in that place, how many wonderful things happen. How many amazing things happen for us and for others. When we're doing that kind of inner work, we raise the vibration for everyone around us. So when the giver gives to get and has that old voice of, gotta give, giving is receiving, they need the new mantra that yes, mother, or whoever taught me that, giving is receiving, and so is receiving giving. Because if I'm doing all the giving, that means I'm not letting somebody else do the giving. So it's all about balance. The Enneagram is about finding the balance within, because the balance is what creates wholeness. And from wholeness, again, amazing, beautiful things happen to you and to your others. So when the loving giver is in tune with that mantra, giving is receiving, and so is receiving giving. I need a balance. I can't burn out and get resentful. I need to have practice good self-care, and not just on the surface, but really knowing what I need, because their area of avoidance is their personal needs, their needs. They don't pay attention to their needs if they're not healthy. It's all about the other. And what happens when you're all about the other, who could just shout out what happens to you when you're all about the other constantly, forever and ever and a day? You lose yourself. But what emotion do you start to feel when you're resentment? You can't do that without getting angry if no one's giving back to you. It's the human condition. We like reciprocity. We need reciprocity. It's important in our lives. So yes, giving is receiving, and so is receiving giving. So when that person is there, they receive from the high side of 4, and they're creative, and they're artistic, and they're romantic, and their sensitivity is heightened, and they are very individualistic and unique, but they know you are too. They're not at the low side of 4 where they're trying too hard to be special. They're just, we're all special, and here's my creative no. I can't help you today because I'm going to be taking care of another priority. Or, it's the classic healthy 2 can sit on her hands at a volunteer meeting when everybody's raising their hand and she wants to go, oh, I can always do more. I could help, I could do more. She needs to sit on her hands and say, let me think about that a little bit. Can I get back to you? That's a healthy response for a 2. Because her tendency is always going to be to want to help. So she's not going to err on the side of not helping enough. Are you with me? So each of these personalities, if they go into an extreme, they run into their opposite, is the point. So if you're good to a fault and perfectionistic, you become angry or righteous. If you're loving, giving to a fault, how is being resentful being loving? It's really not a very loving state to be in when you are resentful, right? And angry. And so this is how this wisdom is applying. It's giving us these nuggets of truths that resonate deeply. And I remember asking my professor in my curriculum, because, this is bound to bring up a little bit of anxiety, because then you're like, oh, I've been kind of doing it maybe a little bit wrong sometimes, like I want to be centered. I want to come from that more. But we're all in process. There's no race. It's all about process and just understanding what you want out of this and how you want to learn and how you want to grow. Anyway, I remember saying to Jerry Wagner, well, if our personalities are formed by the time we're 4, now they believe our personalities are formed by about the time we're 4 experts, how do we get to the higher side of who we're called to be or meant to be? And Jerry's a 5, and sensing the anxiety in the room, he made a little joke, a little funny, went to the low side of joyful there, and he said, we do it about a minute a month. And something was born inside of me at that moment to say no. We have to do this more than a minute a month. We have to do this more than a minute a day. We have to do this more than a minute an hour. We can be conscious. See, this is a personality to higher consciousness model. But what happens when we are in higher consciousness is we make great relationships. Because if we're doing that kind of work within ourselves, generally we are attracting that to ourselves. And think about leaders of countries if they did this work. Instead of projecting their blame on everyone else or projecting their stuff, they would take responsibility and lead in such a better way. There would be just for couples, for, marriages, for parenting, and there are all sorts of books, the Enneagram of Parenting and Elizabeth Weigel, and I can give you a lot of resources or you can find them on the internet. But the point that the reason this is so powerful for so many people across the world, and I've taught it in living rooms, corporations, and cruise ships, it's so universal. It's just everybody finds something in it that speaks to them and they say, yeah, I want that wellness map. I want that. I want to go to the higher side of who I'm meant to be every day because that's when things work easier. So let's look at 3. So the emotional passion for 3 is deceit. That doesn't mean 3's performing types, achieving types like to lie. That's not, the word is a little bit misleading there. It's that they reframe for success. So 3's effective achievers they first of all bring to the table, they get us to move and shake and they're goal oriented and they're, at the high end, they're going to be very successful, but it's going to be a success that's built on team and inner motivation and inner truth. When they're disconnected, the 3 lets image and role and being a chameleon to everybody else kind of trump their feelings. And so they need to turn that around and say, for example, I've been at this job 60 hours this week. Somebody might say to their boss, I'm very depleted. I am not going to be able to give you much quality work here. It's time for me to go. And that might be very difficult for a 3 because that looks like failure and they avoid failure. Their area of avoidance or blind spot is failure. So the tendency is for the 3 to mask feelings, to wear a mask, to be what you want me to be, to, at the very worst image is to be a chipmunk on roller skates, I say, doing whatever anybody needs till they basically are able to almost do it no longer, and they go to the low side of 9, where they get very zoned out, and conversely, when they are paying attention to that and saying, my feelings count, and I am not letting my feelings, get buried under all what is supposed to be the image of me as this worker at this company or father or husband or friend, whatever the role they're in, that can take on an overdrive. So when they note that, what is happening is they are paying attention to their inner truth. The inner truth, the 6 has a strong, strong inner knowing that's, I told you in the beginning that the force is with us, not against us. They pay attention to that. And that is what is when the 3 centers comes into them. So, their area of avoidance, I said, was failure. So they need to name that failure bothers them and maybe work through the failure instead of push it down. Work it through. So this is again a very simplistic because each of these there's many nuances to each of these types, but to get you sort of familiar with it, and I have to go with the fact that some people don't know anything about it in the room. This emotional passion or driving energy, which is this big word here, and then the area of avoidance is the smaller one, or the blind spot. Those contribute to how you feel, you know. So if you're paying attention to that and you're managing your emotional passion and you're working through the blind spot. So I like to say, you know, circle those emotional passions in red, sort of like a stop, drop, and roll. You know, I'm going to stop on this. I'm going to be aware of it, and I'm going to work it through. I'm going to manage it. And then the green, circle the areas of avoidance or the blind spots in green so that you learn to work through them. Pay attention to them by working through. Green, go through. Red, stop, pay attention. That's a real helpful way to, when you know your type, because again, I'm teaching you about all the types tonight. And it's really helpful to do your own work individually because this is a lot of information, right, to take in at 7, at night. But what I want you to remember is that each type has these emotional passions or driving energies. They each have the blind spot, and they each have corresponding types that, when they center, gift and grace them or take them down further. And if you remember that much about this paradigm, you will go home knowing that this has great gifts to offer you. So I did 1, 2, and 3. Let's go up to, I did 9 too, 9, 1, 2, and 3. So let's go to the wise observer. The wise observer brings, an ability to analyze, take things apart, synthesize, see the whole. They are brilliant. They bring all these wonderful things to the table: non-judgment, objectivity, their emotional passion is a greed of self. They, when they're disconnected, would prefer to be in their cave, real or metaphorical. So they might be withholding when you're next to them, and they may not share very much or want to, sort of like this for the 5. You're sharing with them on a heart-to-heart basis, right? And they get a little prickly in their heart. Even if they're very emotionally well, they still will have a tendency to feel that. And so that feels a little strange. And then depending upon how emotionally centered and well they are in that moment too, if they stay with you in that, you know that they have that capacity. But if they don't, they will go up into their head and into their cave. So I gave you a sheet of paper that also said which types are, I divided these 9 types into a triad, 3 triads. So 8, 9, and 1 are gut-oriented types. I'll close with this and then we can have a few questions after. But this is very wonderful shortcut to learning something good about the Enneagram. The 8, 9, and 1, the powerful protector, peaceful mediator, and good reformer, are gut-oriented types. This means these are called instinctual centers. This means their knowing comes to them that way in the gut. The 2, loving giver, 3, effective achiever, and 4, original or romantic types are heart types. This means their knowing comes that way. And it's just they're very well practiced in these areas, right? The gut or the heart. Now the 5, the wise observer, the 6, the loyal skeptic, and the 7, the joyful adventurer, are head types. So their knowing is strong this way. However, because this is all about paradox also, when you're on overdrive, what heart looks like is drama. And when you're making decisions when you can't sleep at night because your mind keeps going and going and going and going, that's monkey. We use a term called monkey mind, right? Jumping from thing to thing to thing, but never solving the problem. Spinning our wheels. And when you are a gut-oriented person who's on overdrive, you might have a knee-jerk reaction, hence the word jerk. You feel like a jerk after you said something that you didn't really mean to say. So the best way to problem solve is to wait till all three centers are aligned. So don't solve problems out of an overly dramatic heart. You know, if you're a heart type or you're feeling all of that emotion, then you want to balance that with what's going on in your head, but not just what's in your head, what's in your gut. So you might ask the question to, you know, did my neighbor who sprayed water at my dogs, is she really a bad person? Did we really move into the wrong neighborhood? Or is she just afraid? You activate your compassion, right? If you're a head type. Activate that compassion and calm down that worry. And then check that question out in your gut. And then pretty soon no, she told me, I know she's not a bad person. I know she's okay. She told me, I think once, that her son got bit by a dog. Yeah, that's right. Oh, you know, and then you go over and say, well, would it be helpful if I kept the dogs, you know, over here when we have a fence, but would it be helpful if I put them over here? Oh, yes. And then 6 months later, she's in your home having dinner and you have the dogs in the garage. So, you know, you solve problems because you align the head information with the heart, with the gut. You don't make decisions, or when we make these decisions, and we do because we're human, we will, but it's a much better way of making decisions and solving problems. And then also a last point, this is, do you see how this is, it's sort of like a little caricature. Think of it as an angel body, and these are wings. So the wings in the Enneagram are just the next door neighbors of the type. So the points at which you see the letters, or the numbers, are the core type, the core personality type. And the wing styles are the next door neighbors of the type. And you have two wings to fly, but one is dominant. And that also informs you about your gifts. And your, on the Enneagram that I would give, you would see if you're coming from the resourceful aspect, high side of each of these types, particularly your type, and you'd see if you were coming from the less resourceful, in which you need some work, you know, and we all do, because we're all in process. So thank you for your attention and time. And does anybody have a question?
Do you see a correspondence between Jung's archetypes and the collective unconscious and this theory?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question, and I love it because I studied Carl Jung, and I don't know enough about it. I have to be really honest. I want to say that would lend itself, but you really have to do careful studies. I know we did do a very careful study down at Loyola with the Myers-Briggs with this, and there were not enough correlations to say that introverted, INFJs, introverted, intuitive, feeling judgment people were this particular, often, or the majority of the time, fell within this type. They couldn't prove that. There weren't enough. So I don't know.
Is it possible for a person to change their type over the course of their lifetime?
It's very, I would be the kind of person that would say never, but the expert opinion answer to that is we absolutely change, but we do not change personality types. We become more resourceful in the personality that we are. But you don't go like, well, 2 years ago I feel like I was more of a 6 and now unless you took one of these profiles and you had equal parts both, which I like to call a hybrid flower. It's like you might, there's not too many, but in 17 years and giving in the thousands of this profile, I've had a few people who are equal parts both. 2s and 6s, or, so then they look at all the information in those two personality types that inform and help them.